So, welcome everyone. I'd like to introduce you to our panel. This is our first broadcast, our first podcast with the NJSHA Multicultural Committee. Let's start with our guests. We have Dr. Sienna Sun. She's a professor at St. Elizabeth University.
Hello, everyone.
She's a bilingual practitioner. She speaks Mandarin Chinese, Shanghai Chinese. She has an understanding of Korean. Her research interests are in speech sound disorders and using AI technologies. I'd also like to introduce you to Dr. Isabelle Barriere. She's a professor at St. Elizabeth University and a bilingual expert who speaks French, Spanish, a little bit of Haitian. She has research in multilingual language acquisition, focusing primarily on children between the ages of 2 and 5, and she consults for complex multilingual assessments. So welcome, Dr. Barriere.
Thank you.
Okay, and then I am Kim Saborin. I'm the professor and program director at St. Elizabeth University. I'm a stuttering specialist and a monolingual speaker. I am also a member of the NJSHA Multicultural Committee. And we're hoping to be joined later by Samantha Hernandez, who is a bilingual practitioner and member of the NJSHA Multicultural Committee. So let me start with you, Dr. Barriere.
Okay, so of course, the most widely spoken, the language spoken by most people in New Jersey is English. That's like, there is no doubt about this. We are in the United States. But there are many speakers of many different languages, including Spanish and what's called Chinese, but I'll let my colleague kind of explain a little better that Chinese is not very meaningful in itself because it can actually be many different languages, such as Mandarin, Cantonese, etc. But we also have many other languages like Portuguese, Hindi, etc., that have smaller population. We have Arabic, Korean, languages from Africa like Yoruba, etc. So the Russian, Haitian, so there are many different languages in New Jersey. And the maps here show like the north and south of New Jersey. I couldn't put everything on one slide because there are so many languages so the list are the different languages, okay? And sometimes groups of languages. So you can see that New Jersey, just like the Tri-State area in general, is extremely multilingual.
Okay, great. And so my first question for you, Dr. Barriere, is how would we define bilingualism when we're doing assessment?
Okay, so bilingualism is when you have a client who in some contexts in the different contexts in their lives, they may use different codes. By codes, I mean like languages with different vocabulary, different sounds, different sentence structure. And this is regardless of whether this language is spoken by many people or not, whether the language exists much in writing or not, so the fact that somebody can function to some degree in these different languages. So maybe some of the languages are for a very limited kind of context, but they still exist in that person's life, okay? Which means that this person has more than one language in their mind.
So as long as they are exposed to more than one language, they're considered as bilingual speakers.
Yeah.
The frequency, the exposure can vary a lot, but they don't really matter in terms of the definition. I think that's what Dr. Barriere tried to point out.
Yeah, and also it doesn't mean like, because some people say, oh, I speak another language, but I'm not really bilingual. Well, yes, you are. It's not because you're not like, you may be more proficient in some areas in the language and less proficient in another. Maybe you understand the language a lot, but you don't produce that much. Well, you still have a head start compared to people who have never been exposed to that language. Okay,
So my next question is, what is the best way to find out which language a child or a family uses?
Okay, so this is one of the most difficult aspects, and I think under-mentioned in the literature. Like often we read papers or we are told how to assess bilingual children, but it's like, it's not when you look at a child that you know that they have another language. So one of the important things for service providers is that their environment shows that they are welcoming to other languages and cultures. Because if they don't show that, if the parent believes, oh, my child is only going to be enrolled in your preschool or in your school, or can only access your clinical services because, if they are English speakers, then it's likely that you're not going to get the information that you need. So it's very important that there are signs in the environment that show that you value different cultures, different languages, etc., and that you build a relationship of trust. So that's one of the important issues. The second issue is that the languages have names that are not always helpful in informing you of which language a child is actually exposed to. Okay, so let me take a couple of examples. So I talked earlier about how the label Chinese doesn't in itself mean much unless you find out which Chinese, which can be kind of maybe, it can be a conversation with the parent, but I think some parents will have a sense of whether they speak Mandarin
or dialect.
A word that I don't like using very much, so I'll keep away from this. But so sometimes it's a question of knowing which area, for instance, in China they're from, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that will help. There are other languages that are even a little bit more difficult because, like, for instance, under the label Pidgin or Creole, there are many, about 400 languages, and somebody can say, I speak Creole, but if they don't specify the geographical area where that Creole is spoken, then, you will end up with, you won't know, okay? So what you need to find out is more about the geography, like where these people come from, and ask it in a way where they don't feel like you're questioning their legal status or anything. Another thing is that it's very important to remember that, so for the Caribbean, the place can tell you something, but it's still, there are many places where the place doesn't tell you much because, for instance, a country like Nigeria has like more than 50 languages, I think. So you need to kind of get more information. There is, Brandon, can you show the last slide, please? So there is a database called Ethnologue where you can look up a country and it's going to tell you all the languages. I mean, you can also try Wikipedia. So Wikipedia, if you look up a country, it normally gives you the list of languages. And the good thing about Ethnologue is that it will also give you the language under its different names, okay? So these are the different ways that, that you can find out about, like which language a child speaks. And then the different languages that children speak, their level of documentation is very different. So for some languages, you will be able to find out like, like what the sound system compared to English. For some other languages, it's going to be much harder.
Right.
Okay? It depends on how much work has been done about it. But between Wikipedia and Ethnologue, you should be able to find out what has been done, if anything has been done.
Okay, all right. Thank you for that. My next question is for you, Dr. Sun. Dr. Barrier mentioned building a relationship of trust, and I would like to ask you this question. So for bilinguals and monolingual speakers, SLPs in particular, what do we need to know in order to properly assess multilingual children?
So I would say ideally, if we know that child is bilingual, and a matching bilingual provider will be the best because you can communicate, you understand the languages, and you can talk to the parents in their language. They'll trust you immediately. Based on my experience so far, like when I talk in Mandarin Chinese with Chinese families, they are like, oh my God, let me tell you. They will like open up immediately. And also like I can observe, I can collect different speech samples, language samples in both English and Mandarin Chinese. So ideally, I would say a matching bilingual provider will be the best to appropriately evaluate and treat, and also will be best consultant to the family as well. But like in real world, we know that we don't have a lot of bilingual providers. And when I teach my students, and they are monolingual English speakers, I tell them like, you are still qualified service provider. You can provide services using the appropriate resources, appropriate tools. The use of translator, the use of interpreter, and get some research done before you interview the parents to get to know the culture, the languages, and also like be open about what they tell you. That the things they tell you might be very different from what you expect, but be open-minded will be really helpful to get a good case history to understand the potential language disorder versus language differences.
I'd like to have a follow-up question about using translators, because I think sometimes what happens is we pull a translator or we use a family member. So can you speak a little bit more about that, whether to use an actual translator or to use a family member?
So I wanted to say, like, most of the times, family members are better translators because they understand their situations. They will provide detailed information, so things won't get lost in translation. But sometimes, depending on the education levels or their understanding of your questions, they don't really provide the accurate information. They'll exaggerate it, like the problems, or sometimes they'll hide some information from you. So that's a potential problem using a family member as translator. So pros and cons.
Pros and cons,
I
right?
wanted to bring my experience. I was an interpreter and a translator in England, including in the context of speech-language pathology sessions. And yes, this is an issue, but it's also like it's important not just to get an interpreter or a translator that knows the language, but also, I mean, so you can have a Spanish interpreter, but if your client is from Puerto Rico and your interpreter is from Mexico, it doesn't mean the culture match. Okay, so you have to be mindful of that as well. They have to be mindful of that. But yes, there is there is no conflict of interest normally with respect to translating professionally compared to having a family member.
And I do know from my own personal experience that it does help a lot to pay attention and then also be ready to ask more details. So for example, to use an example that Dr. Sun and I shared in an assessment, and I was interviewing the parent, I remember him saying that his child preferred to play with spinny toys, and then Dr. Sun said, spinning is not something we have in our language. And so I said, well, when you say spinning, what do you mean? And he said, well, like that, like the ball. So that was an example of where we could have had an interpreter misinterpret it to a point of it would have had a completely different meaning, because a young child who prefers to play with spinning toys versus a young child who prefers to play with balls is a very different interpretation.
Right, and like I think the way we ask the questions really matters. Sometimes, like if we ask them, do your children speak another language? They'll be like, no. But if you ask them, oh, what languages do you speak at home? They'll be like, oh, we speak this and that. I'm like, then your child is exposed to the other language and they probably are bilingual speakers. They're like, no, but they don't speak it. They only understand it. So the way we ask often like kind of like lead their answers differently. Mm-hmm. So I think providers need to be, like as you said, need to be careful like how we ask questions.
Yes, because it could lead into a whole different way
whole
of
different
assessing,
answers,
right?
yes.
If I was listening to only spinning toys, I would have gone into a
like
different
spinning
direction
versus
with regard
like,
to my assessment.
Like I still don't know the English word for like when you
it's round?
Round,
Right.
like turn maybe?
Right.
So different verbs
Right.
have different meanings in different languages.
So being specific with your questions sometimes and really making sure that you understand and that things are not getting lost in translation is really important. So what materials and protocols do you usually use in a bilingual assessment?
So it depends on the cases. Like if they speak Mandarin Chinese or a version of Chinese that I understand, I will do both English and Chinese assessment. Like meaning I will use the standardized testing, like subtest or whole test in both English and Chinese. But sometimes if, depending on the age or their suspected disorders, I would like to use dynamic assessment or like a narrative assessment, which is like informal, non-standardized testing. to evaluate their language and speech levels. So usually if the kid is age appropriate and also their attention and also cognitive levels are appropriate for standardized testing, I would use definitely either translated standardized test, and if not, a dynamic assessment is my go-to, is my golden tool. I always use dynamic assessment. And then if dynamic assessment is too hard, too difficult, I'll use narrative sample to at least get something from them so I can analyze. So narrative, there's a good tool called MAIN, Multilingual Assessment. I can't remember. MAIN, that's the abbreviation. MAIN assessment is a narrative assessment. It has different languages, and it also has a very relatively structured protocol that providers can follow easily.
Can you elaborate a little bit more on what you mean when you say dynamic assessment for our listeners who are not familiar with that term?
So we do test. So we give them, for example, a 3-year-old, I will give them a ball, and then I will teach them, okay, bounce, bounce, pat, pat, so one of those verbs. And so that's teach. And then I will, that's test, and to see if they can label either the verbs or repeat after me, and then I will teach. So assuming they don't really know the verbs or the word that I'm teaching, and then the next stage is I will use different strategies, visual cues, gestural cues, repetitions, or different activities to really focus on that verb. For example, we're just teaching them the verb pat. So I will say pat, pat, like I'll show them, and then I'll use different people or different characters to pat the ball differently, and then still pat. So after different teaching strategies, so we'll do another stage, which is called retest. So to see if my teaching strategies work. So ideally, like the language doesn't really matter, like English, Chinese. So as long as they are able to learn the new verb, the target verb that I'm teaching, we will say like the internal mechanism of language learning is intact, which is okay. So if they cannot learn, all my strategies fail, so we can kind of conclude our hypothesis like this kid is enabled to learn a new word, so like leading to like a language disorder. So that the language they are exposed to don't really matter, because dynamic assessment is really assessing the internal mechanism of learning a language.
And you do that test in English, so
Yes,
I
in
could
English.
do that test. I
Yes,
could do a dynamic assessment.
Yes, anybody can do a dynamic. And
Right.
sometimes for speech, so that's language, right? For speech assessment, I'll teach them a nonsense word. I'll be like a bloop. So the word I go is like bloop, so this is bloop. And if they can learn the but, la, and then the syllable structure, that means they can learn this new way to talk. It doesn't really matter what language they speak.
And if there's a dynamic assessment and they're picking up new English words quickly, does that generally tell you that they may not have a language disorder, that it's just not enough exposure? Is that usually what that means?
Yeah, if they can pick up the word, or like if my strategies really work, that means they have the ability to learn and the learning strategies are working, and also whatever impairment or disorder speech or disorder language we see right now might be just a delay instead of a real impairment.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. That's great. Okay, so either one of you can answer this question, but I'd like to find out more about how we could promote bilingualism and bilingual services and why it's so important.
Go
That's
ahead,
a big
Isabel.
question. Big question.
Yeah, that's a big question. Yeah, so I think it's my colleague Barbara Zura-Pearson who has written a book that's a guide for parents on how to raise bilingual children. And I think somewhere in this book she says, I've met many parents who regret not speaking their mother tongue to their children. I've yet to meet one who regrets. Mm-hmm. You know, and you know, there are many children, and I also see that in my work. You know, there are many people who regret, you know, not being able to use the language of their parents or their grandparents, etc. Another thing, and this is based on workshops that I run with Spanish-speaking and Russian-speaking parents, there is that crucial time in a child's life when they have developed their oral language and they learn to read, and in these countries they will learn to read in English, of course. I mean, in most children. And when you learn to read, when you start being like a skilled reader, this is where you're going to learn more complex structures, new words, a lot of interesting things. So if you don't read in your mother tongue, it's going to be very hard to keep up that mother tongue. And it was interesting to me because I worked a lot. I worked for a while with Russian-speaking parents, and the new generation of parents is very different from the old one because I think they realize that it's not enough to speak the language. It's also like if you want them to know the culture, and to be able to discover things by themselves in this new language. Otherwise, English is going to be very dominant, and they will not learn many new things in that other language. So I think and also if you think about it, you have like Caucasian people like me sending their children to Spanish-speaking or Mandarin-speaking schools, so they become professionals in those languages. And then you have heritage speakers of these languages who cannot really necessarily work in them because they haven't got this like higher level language skills that they could. I mean, the journey between learning to speak and reading is much shorter than not knowing a language and learning to speak it, trust me. So I think, so these are the different things I would think. I mean, so it's like surround yourself with books and try to make this other language like exciting. It would be terrible to use the mother tongue only to scold the child. That's really bad. Mm-hmm. If you can enroll children in dual language programs, there is a new French dual language program in New Jersey somewhere. I mean, there are more and more dual language programs, and their goal is to develop the academics in the two languages. Mm-hmm. But even if you don't have all that, depending on the language, etc., and where you are, at least like have as many like artifacts in the other languages you can.
So I hear what you're really saying is not only exposing them to the mother tongue and their heritage languages, but surrounding themselves with books, enrolling them in dual language programs. And that kind of gets to my next question, which was a common question that we may get from parents is, oh, if my child's delayed, if they have a language delay because or some other problem, should we not speak or only speak in one language? So I'm sure you want to say more about that. So I want to make sure we're very clear about what we would recommend.
So would you ever say to your friend who is a pianist, because you want to learn the cello, you should really stop playing the piano, because playing the piano is going to be really bad for you developing the cello? That would never come to people's mind, because with music we have an understanding that there is something very different about playing the piano and the cello at the motor level, but both of those are, in order to play both of those, you need some foundation in music. So just like Dr. Sun was talking about when she talked about this dynamic assessment, like it doesn't matter in which language, both cello and playing the guitar or the piano, it's music. So if you have foundation in music, so there is no, it is very clear that no single speech or language disorders is triggered by bilingualism. It is also clear that if you have a speech or language disorder as a child in one language, you'll have it in the other language. But hey, you'll still speak bilingual, Exactly. So I just wanted to know, it's interesting to me because in my years, in my research, I've worked with the Yiddish-speaking communities that has throughout history been a multilingual community, and in that community there is no question. You may be a child with Down syndrome, a child with autism. You have to function in a multilingual community. So that's...
Yes, so we can guarantee all the parents, if parents are listening, I'm a parent too, and I speak 3 languages in my house. So I was worried for a second. I was like, well, this caused confusion, and then immediately I know this will not cause confusion. So I tell all the parents now, 100%, bilingual, multilingualism will not cause confusion, will not hinder their development. And especially for those people who have some sort of communication disorders or like Down syndrome, autism, other type of disorders, bilingualism, multilingualism are actually helpful to develop their emotion capability and flexibility, and also social interactions. And that affection, that connection in mother tongue is very unique. It helps them to build social interactions with people. So not only it's not problematic, it is actually helpful.
Yeah, exactly.
And I'm going to add, as a stuttering expert, that the same thing is true for stuttering. So if you have a child who stutters and they're bilingual, you absolutely want to give them all exposure to all the languages.
Yes.
Okay, I think I've covered all of the questions that I want to ask. What I would like to do, if we want to just, anything you would like to add, anything that we didn't cover that you think we need to just say before we end
I think
our-
we need more bilingual providers.
We
That's
do.
why SEU is SLP program. We highlight multilingualism, bilingualism, and we try to encourage people from different backgrounds to join our program to become a bilingual provider in the future. We desperately need more.
And I will say that many of the New Jersey schools also have bilingual emphasis programs. And we have the multicultural committee. So if you are a member of NJSHA, we always welcome other members. You do not have to speak more than one language in order to become a member of the multicultural committee. We are also working on right now putting together a bilingual service provider list in the state of New Jersey. So that's something that we're working on right now. And then we're going to continue to offer these podcasts. So please look for us again for our next podcast. And we're going to continue our series on multilingualism and bilingualism here at St. Elizabeth and part of the NJSHA community. So thank you both of our guests for being here. And thank you, NJSHA and the Multicultural Committee, for allowing us to host this podcast.